We're going to go through the history of antimicrobial drugs and also look at the spectrum of antibiotics. Remember that chemotherapy in microbiology, we're talking about using antimicrobial drugs internally to kill or inhibit the growth of microorganisms in our tissues. We have a couple of different types of antimicrobial drugs. We have antibiotics, which remember are just going to be getting rid of the bacteria. So they're not going to be any good for getting rid of your cold, which are caused by viruses. We have antifungal drugs, antiprotozoan drugs, and also antiviral drugs. We'll go through all of these, but we're going to spend most of our time talking about antibiotics. And the antibiotics are actually naturally made by some bacteria, and that'll fill in our first blank here. And they're also made by some of the mold, so one of our fungi. And remember that these bacteria and mold are naturally making the antibiotics to kill off their neighbors, so that they can get all of the food and living space so they don't have to compete for that. This is just a table you can look at, and it's just showing you examples of some of the bacteria that make some of these different antibiotics. And then we also have some examples of mold that make some of the antibiotics as well. So you can just look these over. You don't have to memorize any of these. And there's actually some of these in here, like this griseofovin, that's actually an antifungal drug instead of an antibiotic. We'll look at a little bit of the history of the development of some of our antimicrobial drugs. Remember that the scientists, the only names you need to know are the ones in red. So we talked about Paul Ehrlich before. Remember that he developed the first treatment for an infectious disease caused by microorganisms. So remember, he developed salvarsan, that arsenic drug used to treat syphilis. He also came up with this idea of selective toxicity. And what's meant by that is that you want the antibiotic to be selectively toxic and just kill the microorganism and not kill the patient or cause side effects in the patient. So that's what we mean by selective toxicity. And Paul Ehrlich at the time, he called it, this idea, the magic bullet. So you want the antibiotic just to kill the syphilis bacteria, but not cause side effects in the patient. We also had, in the 1930s, we had another scientist discover the sulfa antibiotics. Next we have Alexander Fleming, who rediscovered penicillin in 1928. We had talked about him before. Remember that he discovered penicillin quite by accident. He was going on vacation, he was studying Staph aureus, he didn't do his dishes before he left. He left his petri dishes stacked up by the sink, the lids were off, his window was open, and some penicillium mold drifted in, landed on his petri dish, and when he came back from vacation, he noticed the mold growing on his plates, and the bacteria growing around the mold had been killed off. And so he thought that was really interesting and was able to isolate the penicillin antibiotic that the mold was producing, but he wasn't a chemist, and so he wasn't able to get enough of the penicillin antibiotic to actually test in an animal to see if it actually would cure a bacterial infection. So he published his paper. Nobody really paid attention to it until 1940, when some other scientists came along and they found Fleming's paper, and they're like, hey, this is really amazing. And so they were able to isolate more of the penicillin antibiotic and actually test it out on a person. And so they went into a London hospital and they found a policeman, Albert Alexander, who had gotten a shrapnel wound on his cheek because it was World War II and they were bombing London, and he had gotten this cut from the shrapnel on his cheek and it got infected. And I can't remember if it was staph or strep bacteria that gotten in there. And the infection was so bad on his face that they'd had to remove his eyeball already. And he was dying of this bacterial infection. And they had nothing to treat him with because they didn't have antibiotics yet. So they're like, well, let's try the penicillin out on him. So they treated him with the penicillin for 5 days, which is all they had, and then they ran out of the penicillin. And initially he got better, but the 5 days of the penicillin wasn't enough to get rid of all the bacteria. So unfortunately, the infection came back, and then he died a month later of his infection, which was really sad. And if you're interested, there's a really good show here, Pain, Pus, and Poison. It's about an hour long, but it talks about Fleming and some of the other antibiotic discoveries and other drug discoveries. That's actually really an interesting show if you want to watch that. And then you don't have to memorize any of these, but just throughout the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot more antibiotics that were discovered because they started looking in the soil at some of the bacteria and the molds that were living there. And they found a lot of antibiotics that they were producing, and then they isolated those and started treating people with those. So let's just take a look at a couple of definitions here. We've got selective toxicity, which we've talked about before. So remember, this is just talking about that we want the antimicrobial drug to kill the microorganism, but not hurt the patient. So we want it to be selective in who it's toxic to. So toxic to the microorganism, but not to the patient. And then we have the therapeutic dose, and this is pretty straightforward. So this is just the drug level required to treat the infection. And then the toxic dose is the drug level where we start to see side effects, so it becomes toxic for the patient. And then the therapeutic index, this is really important to know. So this is just where we take the toxic dose and divide it by the therapeutic dose. And this is a measure of drug safety. So let's explain how the therapeutic index works. All right, so to calculate the therapeutic index, we're going to take the toxic dose of the drug and then divide that by the therapeutic dose. And this is just a measure of drug safety. And we'll show you how this works. All right, and when we calculate this out, we want a high therapeutic index. So we want a high number. All right, so let's say we've got 2 different drugs that we can choose from to treat our patient. And let's say that drug A has a toxic dose of 2 milligrams of the drug per kilogram of the patient's body weight. And let's say the therapeutic dose that we need to treat the infection is 1 milligram of the drug per kilogram of the patient's body weight. And if we calculate that out, we end up with a therapeutic index of 2. And let's say that the therapeutic dose of 1 mg per kg, let's say that's 1 pill that the patient has to take to treat their infection. But if you look at the toxic dose, being 2 mg per kg, that's where we start to see side effects. So what if our patient took their morning pill, but maybe they were half asleep and they forgot that they took their morning pill and they couldn't remember whether they took it or not. So they're like, well, I might as well just take a pill in case I didn't take it. So they end up taking 2 pills instead of 1. And unfortunately, if they take 2 pills, now they're at the toxic dose and they're going to have some side effects. So this drug A, I would be a little concerned about prescribing because the therapeutic dose, the dose that we need to actually treat the infection, is pretty close to the toxic dose where we're going to see side effects. So if the patient, instead of just taking 1 pill, they made a mistake and took 2 pills because they forgot, you could have some side effects. So we have a pretty low therapeutic index for drug A. Okay, let's take a look at drug B. And let's say that for drug B, we've got a toxic dose where we see side effects. Let's say it's 10 mg per kg. And let's say our therapeutic dose, just to make it easy, let's say it's the same 1 mg per kg. And so if we divide those, we end up with a therapeutic index of 10. And so you can see that for drug B, they just need to take 1 pill to treat their infection with drug B. But to get side effects, they would have to take 10 pills to reach that toxic level and get side effects. And so that would be pretty unlikely that the patient would accidentally take that many pills. Okay, so drug B would be a much safer drug, okay, because it has a much higher therapeutic index. This toxic dose is a lot higher. It's a lot further away from that therapeutic dose, and so it's pretty unlikely that your patient would, take 10 pills by accident. So I would feel more comfortable prescribing drug B than drug A if everything else was equal. Okay, so that's how the therapeutic index works. Okay, so it's just a measure of drug safety, and you would prefer to prescribe a drug with a high therapeutic index. And I'm not going to make you do any calculations with this on the exam. So I just want you to understand what therapeutic index is, just know the definition and just basically what it means. That's it. Okay, just some other definitions. We have narrow spectrum drugs. What that's talking about are, for example, if you have a narrow spectrum antibiotic, that just means that it's only going to get maybe a few types of bacteria, and that's it. Okay, so it's not going to get very many. Versus broad spectrum antibiotics, those will get lots of different types of bacteria. Okay, so maybe they get both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, whereas maybe a narrow spectrum drug, maybe it only gets gram-positives or something like that. Okay. All right, so let's just answer these questions that are underneath here. So why are there fewer antibiotics that get gram-negative bacteria than the gram-positive bacteria? And we've talked about this before. So remember that the gram-negative bacteria are going to be harder to kill with our antibiotics because of their structure. The gram-negative bacteria, they have the outer membrane, and that will prevent some of the antibiotics from getting into the gram-negative cell, and if the antibiotic can't get in, it can't kill the gram-negative cell. So that's why there's fewer antibiotics that will get the gram-negative bacteria, because there's not as many that can get through that outer membrane. Okay, and then the next question, what is the disadvantage of using broad spectrum antibiotics? So if we have a choice, we would prefer to use a narrow spectrum antibiotic that will just get the bacterium that is causing the infection in our patient. We try to avoid the broad spectrum antibiotics if we can. And the reason that is because the broad spectrum antibiotics will not only kill the bacterium causing maybe the UTI, but It will also kill a lot of other bacteria that are, for example, in your microbiome. So a lot of these good bacteria get killed. And if you do that, like in the gut, for example, you end up killing off all these good bacteria, and then the ones that are resistant to the antibiotic, maybe like C. diff, they end up surviving, and they look around like, hey, everybody's gone and I got all the food and living space, and they just multiply like crazy and they overgrow, and you end up with what's called a super infection. And that is not good. So we try to not use those if we can. We'd rather use the narrow spectrum antibiotics. Okay, I'm not going to ask you the source of the antibiotic, but you can classify them on where they come from. Some of them are natural. We just take them right from the bacteria or the mold that made them. A lot of them are semi-synthetic, meaning that we just take the antibiotics made by the bacteria or the mold and we chemically modify them a little bit in the lab, and then we use those. And then there are some antibiotics that are synthetic or totally man-made. Those would be, for example, the sulfonamide antibiotics, the sulfa drugs. So those are totally man-made. Okay. We also talk about their effect. So like if you have a bactericidal antibiotic, it's going to kill the bacteria. But if you have a bacteriostatic antibiotic, it's just going to inhibit its growth. So it stops the bacteria from reproducing, and that allows your immune system to catch up, and then your immune system will kill it. So some antibiotics are bactericidal and others are bacteriostatic. So it just depends. This picture is just showing the spectrum of some different antimicrobial drugs. And if we take a look at this first one over here, isoniazid, this is a very narrow spectrum antibiotic. So you can see that it's just getting one type of bacteria, just the Mycobacterium. So isoniazid is an antibiotic that's just used to treat TB, and that's it. Okay, so Mycobacterium tuberculosis, that's all it's used to treat. Okay, so that's very narrow spectrum. Another narrow spectrum antibiotic would be penicillin G over here, okay, because it's just getting these gram-positives. A broad spectrum antibiotic would be this tetracycline down here. Okay, that is really broad spectrum. It gets just about everything. So it's going to get the Mycobacterium, gram-negatives, gram-positives, and then even these chlamydia and rickettsias as well. So that's really broad spectrum. So this just shows the effect of using a broad spectrum antibiotic and causing a superinfection. So if you use this broad spectrum antibiotic, and let's say this is the bacteria living in your gut, your microbiome, and maybe this blue bacteria here is C. diff. So these other bacteria are susceptible to the broad spectrum antibiotic, but C. diff a lot of time is resistant, and so it'll survive. The other bacteria get killed off, and then C. diff looks around and says, oh, you know, I've got all this food and living space, and it just starts multiplying and overgrows. And now you've got this bad diarrhea from C. diff. So an example of a superinfection would be a Clostridium difficile or C. diff infection.